The hall of the alien council was never silent. Whispers usually carried in its high stone walls like rivers of doubt. But today, as the human walked through the gates, not one voice dared to rise above a breath. They all stared at him, eyes filled with fear and anger, but not one dared to speak. It was strange for a man from Earth to stand in such a place. Even stranger was the heavy silence that followed his steps. He had not raised his weapon, nor shouted threats. He had only silenced them with his presence. And that silence was sharper than any blade. Long ago, the chosen ones thought of humans as weak. They called them soft creatures who lived too short and feared too much. They laughed at the thought of a human standing among them. But this one, this soldier who had survived more battles than they could count, was different. His silence was not weakness. It was a warning. They had tried to break him in the open arenas, to shame him in front of their warriors, but each time he stood stronger. And when they hurled words like stones, he never answered back. That silence became the weapon they feared most, he remembered. The first night the war began. It was not a war of armies, not yet. It started in a crowded hall much like this one, with voices shouting, accusing, and mocking. They wanted him to bow. They wanted him to beg for mercy. Instead, he simply stood tall. His eyes burned with quiet fire, and his jaw held firm. That moment, when he refused to answer, when he denied them the satisfaction of seeing him break. The whispers began. "He does not fear us," one alien muttered. Another leaned back, uneasy. "Why will he not speak? Why will he not cry out?" And so the silence spread. It unsettled them. It ate at their pride. The more they tried to provoke him, the deeper his silence cut. It was then the chosen ones realized this was not a man they could control. It was a man who would shake their halls and make their people doubt. That was the first battle, and he had won it without a single word. But silence alone was not enough to stop what came next. That night, in the dark corridors beyond the council chambers, he heard the gathering of blades. He knew they would not allow him to live. They could not stand the shame of being silenced by a single human, so they came for him in secret. 5 warriors, each taller than him, each armored in steel and fury. They thought the shadows would protect them. They thought numbers would crush him. But they had forgotten that silence breeds focus. He heard them before they struck. He felt the shift in the air, the tremble of the floor under their boots. And when they lunged, he moved with the speed of someone who had been waiting his whole life for such a test. The first warrior fell with a broken arm. The second with a blade knocked from his grip. The third with breath stolen by a single strike to the chest. The fourth and fifth hesitated when they saw their brothers fall. They had expected fear. They had expected screams. Instead, they faced eyes that carried no words, only a calm fury. They fled into the dark, leaving their shame behind. And when dawn came, the whispers in the council were louder than ever. "They say he fought 5 in the night," one voice carried. "They say none could defeat him," said another. "They say he silenced them without a sound." And so the legend grew. Not a legend of loud speeches or grand boasts, but a legend built from the quiet power of a man who refused to bend. That silence was more dangerous than fire, more cutting than steel. The chosen ones, proud rulers of 1,000 worlds, began to fear not his weapons, but his silence. For silence carried truth. Silence carried defiance. Silence carried the unshakable spirit of a human who would not be broken. Now, as he stood, once more in the hall, eyes staring down 100 alien lords, the air was heavy again. They wanted to hate him, but they could not. They wanted to shout him down, but their throats locked shut. They wanted to remind him he was only human, but their own fear strangled the words. He looked at them calmly, saying nothing, and the silence swallowed the rune whole. And in that silence, he knew the war had already begun. The whispers spread beyond the council hall. They reached the streets of the alien capital. carried on the lips of merchants, guards, and servants. In every corner of the great city, voices lowered when they spoke of the human. Some spoke in fear, some in wonder, and some in envy. But no one could deny the truth. He had silenced those who tried to shame him, and in doing so, he had shaken the balance of power. The chosen ones had ruled for centuries with words sharp as daggers. They had silenced entire races with threats and speeches of dominance. But now their own words failed against him. Every insult thrown at him dissolved in the quiet. Every attempt to mock him returned empty. His silence reflected their weakness, and they hated him for it. Yet, in the same breath, their people began to admire him. To stand alone and still not bow, that was a strength even the most hardened warriors respected. The human knew this was dangerous. Respect from the people meant envy from the rulers. He could already feel their eyes watching from the shadows, plotting. The night of the ambush had only been the beginning. He would face more than blades now. He would face a war not of soldiers, but of voices, lies, and whispers that could destroy nations. But he was not afraid. He had survived worse on Earth wars where survival was counted in seconds, battles where his comrades fell beside him, one by one, and no one came to help. Silence was born in those fields of death. And now that silence was his shield. Days passed, but the tension in the city grew heavier. The alien lords argued among themselves, their pride wounded. Some demanded his execution, saying a creature of Earth had no right to stand in their sacred halls. Others warned that killing him would spark rebellion among the lower races who already admired his defiance, and so the council split. But in their division, the humans saw an opportunity. Where they argued, he only listened. Where they fought with words, he stood in silence. And the people began to see the difference. On the seventh day, the council summoned him again. The chamber was crowded with lords, warriors, and emissaries from 100 worlds. Their robes shimmered with wealth, their armor shone with pride, but their faces carried unease. They wanted to test him once more, to force him into a corner. At the center of the hall stood a warrior chosen to challenge him. The alien was massive, skin marked with scars, eyes burning with fury. He carried a weapon carved from starstone, a blade that hummed with power. "You are no leader," the warrior shouted, voice echoing off the walls. "You are no chosen one. You are a stranger, a shadow, an animal from a forgotten world. I will cut you down before them all, and they will forget your silence." The hall roared with approval, their voices rising like thunder. Yet the human did not answer. He walked forward, step by step, his eyes locked on the warrior. His silence once again crushed the noise. Even as the alien's blade flashed in the air, the human raised no weapon of his own. He simply stood, waiting. The warrior grew angrier. "Speak," he demanded. "Defend yourself." But still, the human said nothing. And then, as the alien lunged, something unexpected happened. The warrior's strike faltered. His blade trembled. For in that silence he felt something he could not name. It was not fear of the human strength, but fear of what that silence meant. It was unbreakable. It was eternal. And for the first time in his long life, the warrior hesitated, the human moved in that moment, faster than the eye could follow. He sidestepped the strike, grabbed the warrior's wrist, and twisted. The starstone blade clattered to the floor. The hall gasped. The alien warrior, who had never been defeated, knelt before the human, unable to break free. And still, not a single word left the human's lips. He released the warrior and stepped back. The silence in the hall was heavier than any roar of victory. The lords shifted uneasily in their seats. They wanted to declare him dangerous, but their voices failed them. They wanted to curse his name, but their throats closed. Around the chamber, whispers rose again, low and careful. "He did not speak," one said. He did not need to. Another leaned closer to a friend. Even our strongest cannot stand before him. What is he? The human turned and left the chamber, his silence trailing behind him like a storm cloud. He had not struck to kill. He had not shouted in triumph. He had only shown them what they feared most, that their weapons, their words, and their pride meant nothing to him. And now the storm he carried within was spreading across the empire. In the streets, the people whispered louder than ever. They spoke not of the warrior who lost, but of the human who had won without a word. And with every whisper, the rulers grew more desperate, for they knew this was no longer a simple challenge. It was the beginning of a war that could not be, fought with swords alone, and the human knew, deep in his heart, that the storm was only beginning. The city was restless. Every corner carried whispers of the human who had defeated a champion without lifting a blade. Some called him a savior, others a curse, but no one dared to ignore him anymore. His silence was no longer just a mystery, it had become a movement. Across the lower districts, slaves, workers, and servants began to mimic him. When beaten, they stopped answering. When mocked, they stood quiet and strong. Silence spread like fire, and the rulers feared it more than rebellion. In the council chambers, the lords argued louder than ever. Their pride could not survive this humiliation. "We cannot allow this," one shouted, his scaled skin trembling with rage. "If we let him live, he will inspire every weak race to rise against us." Another banged his clawed hand on the table. "We tried to shame him. We tried to break him. Now he defies us in front of our own people. What will remain of our power if we allow this silence to grow?" But not all agreed. Some lords leaned back, troubled, their voices low. "Have you not seen how the people look at him? Even some of our own soldiers now speak of his defiance. If we kill him, we may spark the very fire we wish to avoid." The chamber filled with noise, threats, and promises. But in truth, all of them were afraid. Not of his strength alone, but of what he represented. A human who would not bow. A silence that could not be silenced. That night, the human walked the streets quietly, hood pulled over his head. The people saw him, but they did not rush forward. Instead, they lowered their voices, nodding with respect. Children pointed and whispered to their parents. Old warriors looked at him with something close to shame. He had become a shadow moving through their world, and yet brighter than any torch. He entered a tavern where off-duty guards gathered. The room hushed as he stepped inside. One of the guards, drunk with pride, slammed his mug on the table. "You think you're better than us, human?" he spat. "You think silence makes you strong? Speak then, say something. Prove you're not just a ghost haunting our city." His voice cracked with desperation, but the human only looked at him with calm eyes. No anger, no fear, just silence. The guard's face twisted. He raised his hand to strike, but another guard caught his wrist. "Stop," he whispered. "Can't you feel it? He's stronger than us, not with weapons, but with will." Around the room, no one spoke louder than a murmur. The drunk guard lowered his hand, his pride shattered. The human turned and left, never saying a word. And yet the whole tavern buzzed with quiet energy. By the next morning, stories spread faster than fire. They said he had walked into a den of soldiers and silenced them without a fight. They said even the bravest warrior could not look into his eyes without trembling. The rulers grew angrier. Their power depended on fear and obedience. But this man was teaching others that silence could resist both. So the council plotted deeper. They would not attack him with blades this time. They would attack him with lies. Messengers were sent across the empire, spreading stories that the human was a deceiver, a trickster using silence to hide weakness. They whispered that he was cursed, that his silence came from fear, not strength. But their plan backfired. The more they spoke, the more their words felt hollow. For every lie told, the people remembered what they had seen with their own eyes. He did not need words to prove his strength. His silence had already spoken. One evening, a young alien girl approached him in the marketplace. Her hands trembled as she offered him a small piece of bread. "My brother was beaten for refusing to bow," she said softly. "He stayed silent. He said he was following you." The human took the bread gently and nodded once. The girl's eyes filled with tears. "They fear you, but we hope because of you." In that moment, he understood the weight he now carried. His silence was no longer just his own. It belonged to those who had no voice. It belonged to the weak, the forgotten, the broken. The rulers wanted to silence him because he had given silence meaning. And so he realized this was no longer just about survival. It was about war. Not a war of swords, but of will. That night, the council made their move. They summoned him once more, but this time they did not challenge him with warriors. Instead, they brought witnesses, servants, and slaves people who had dared to resist. They wanted to show him that his silence had consequences. In the center of the chamber, the captives knelt in chains, bruised and broken. The High Lord rose from his throne, his voice sharp. "See what your silence has done. These fools followed you. They refused to bow, and now they will pay with their lives." The human stood still, eyes scanning the captives. He felt their fear, their pain. They looked at him with hope, waiting for something, anything. The hall roared with the council's laughter. They thought they had trapped him. They thought his silence would finally break, but he only stepped forward, his presence filling the chamber like a storm about to break. His silence weighed heavier than ever, pressing against every corner of the hall. The laughter faltered. The lords shifted uncomfortably. And the captives, though still in chains, lifted their heads, for in that silence, they knew they were not alone. The chamber was filled with cruel laughter. The High Lord raised his arm, signaling the guards to strike down the captives. The chained servants and slaves closed their eyes, bracing for the blow. But before the first blade could fall, the human moved. He stepped forward slowly, without a weapon, without a word, but his presence froze the entire hall. The guards hesitated. Their orders were clear, yet their hands trembled as they met his eyes. Something about the silence pressed against their hearts. It was not the silence of fear, but of judgment. It was the silence of someone who had already seen death and carried no fear of it. One by one, the guards lowered their blades. Murmurs filled the hall as the people watching realized. The human silence was stronger than the council's commands. The High Lord snarled, his voice breaking the uneasy air. "You will not command my guards. You are nothing but an animal pretending to be a warrior." His words shook the chamber, but the human remained still, calm, and unbroken. The captives, still on their knees, stared at him with wide eyes. Their chains clinked as they straightened their backs. Even in their weakness, they drew strength from his silence. The High Lord, furious, drew his own weapon, a long staff glowing with crimson energy. He slammed it against the floor, and the sound echoed like thunder. "If silence is your weapon, then let us see if silence can protect them from death." Energy surged from the staff toward the captives. The human moved instantly. With bare hands, he caught the blast, his body trembling under the force, but his stance unyielding. The crimson light crackled and burned across his arms, yet he refused to fall. Gasps filled the hall. The alien lords who thought him weak now saw a man who would endure anything to protect those who followed him. The attack faded, leaving scorch marks across his skin, but his eyes never wavered. For the first time, the High Lord stepped back. He had expected screams. He had expected the human to crumble. But there was nothing, only silence. That silence filled the chamber like a weight none could carry. The people began whispering again. "He stopped it," one said. "He stood alone," another whispered. "He does not need words." His silence speaks louder than our rulers. The council erupted into chaos. Some demanded his execution immediately. Others whispered warnings of rebellion. But their words sounded hollow against what everyone had just witnessed. The human walked forward and knelt by the captives. With one hard pull, he snapped the chains that bound them. The hall gasped as the captives stood free, no longer slaves but followers of silence. The High Lord roared in fury. "You dare defy the chosen ones?" His voice shook the walls, but even his power felt small now. He turned to the other lords. "If we allow this, he will destroy us all. He must be ended tonight." The human looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of every alien watching. His silence was not empty. It was filled with promise. A promise that he would not bow, that he would not abandon those who stood behind him. And in that silence, something shifted. For the first time in centuries, the people felt hope stronger than fear. That night, the council ordered soldiers into the streets. They planned to crush the movement before it grew larger. Fires were lit in the lower districts. Anyone suspected of following the human's example was dragged away. Screams echoed across the city. But even as chaos spread, the people resisted, not with violence, not with shouts, but with silence. They stood tall, unflinching, refusing to answer their oppressors. The soldiers grew more afraid with every quiet face staring back at them. The human walked among the fires, pulling survivors from the rubble, helping the wounded to their feet. He did not speak, but his presence gave courage to those who had nothing left. Children clung to him. Old warriors bowed their heads as he passed. His silence became a shield stronger than steel, when the soldiers finally cornered him in the heart of the burning district. 1,000 eyes watched from the shadows. The captain of the guard stepped forward, raising his blade. "You will come with us," he ordered, though his voice wavered. The human said nothing. He simply spread his arms, daring them to strike. The silence stretched, heavy and unbreakable. The soldiers shifted, uncertain. Behind them, the people began to emerge, one by one, filling the street. They said nothing, but their presence grew until hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder, all silent, all unyielding. The soldiers looked around, fear creeping into their eyes. For the first time, they realized their numbers no longer mattered. They could not silence them all. The captain's blade lowered. He stepped back slowly, his courage crumbling. One by one, the soldiers followed, retreating into the night. The people remained, their silence louder than any battle cry. The human stood in the center of them, his skin still burned from the High Lord's attack, his clothes torn, but his spirit unbroken. And in that moment, the people knew the truth. He had given them more than silence. He had given them freedom. The fires of the capital had barely cooled when the whispers spread to the stars. Traders carried stories to distant worlds, and servants repeated them in every port. They spoke of a single human who faced the lords in silence, who broke chains with his bare hands, who stood unyielding even when the High Lord tried to burn him down. Across the empire, ears turned to those whispers, and hearts began to change. On one world, miners paused their work when soldiers ordered them deeper into the pits. They stood silently, their eyes calm, their bodies firm. The soldiers shouted, threatened, and beat them, but the miners refused to speak. Their silence was their defiance, and it spread like a sickness the rulers could not cure. On another world, slaves who had bowed for generations suddenly lifted their heads. When their masters demanded answers, they said nothing, but their silence filled the air with a power greater than words. The rulers felt their grip loosening. They had ruled with fear, with speeches of strength and threats of violence, but silence cut through all of it. It made their threats feel weak. It made their words seem empty. The council gathered again in secret, their voices sharp with desperation. "This human infects our empire," one hissed. Already we see rebellion in the outer colonies. If we do not crush him, the silence will consume us all. Another lord leaned forward, his face shadowed. We have tried warriors. We have tried lies. We have tried fire. None of it works. He must be destroyed with something greater. The High Lord's eyes burned as he spoke. Then we will unleash the weapon. Gasps echoed through the chamber. The weapon was no ordinary force. It was an ancient creation, built for war long before the Chosen Ones rose to power. Locked deep within the heart of their empire, it was a machine of destruction so terrible that even they feared it. Entire cities had vanished under its power. Worlds had been scarred beyond repair. It was not meant to be used again. But their pride left them no choice. While the rulers plotted, the human walked among the people. He carried no crown, no throne. But wherever he went, hope followed. Children ran to him with small gifts, bread, cloth, carved stones. Old men bowed deeply, tears in their eyes. Women stood beside him with pride in their silence. He did not ask for their loyalty, yet they gave it freely. He did not ask them to fight, yet they prepared themselves to stand. One evening, as the sun set over the ruined district, a former guard approached him. The man bowed low. "I once served the council," he said, his voice shaking. "I raised my blade against the weak. But when I saw you stand in silence, I realized I was the weak one. Let me serve you now." Others soon followed, soldiers, merchants, even former overseers who had once ruled with cruelty. His silence had broken their pride and replaced it with respect, but peace was not what the council wanted. The night the weapon was prepared, the skies above the city cracked open. A great shadow descended, a machine larger than mountains, its surface glowing with ancient runes of fire. The people cried out as the ground shook beneath them. The weapon was called the Devourer, and it had one purpose: to erase resistance. From existence. The High Lord's voice boomed across the city through speakers. "See how silence ends, human. See how your defiance brings ruin upon all who follow you. We will burn your silence until nothing remains." The human stood at the center of the square, staring up at the monstrous machine. Around him, thousands of silent followers gathered, their faces pale but unbroken. They looked to him, their last hope. Still, he said nothing. He raised no weapon, but his eyes locked on the machine with unshakable resolve. The Devourer's core began to glow, brighter and brighter, until it seemed the sun itself was about to fall upon them. The ground trembled. The air grew hot. People held their breath, some in fear, some in faith. The council watched from their towers, certain they would finally break him, but the human did not move. His silence wrapped around the people like a shield. In their hearts, they felt something stronger than fear: unity. They stood shoulder to shoulder, thousands of voices refusing to scream, refusing to bow. The silence of one man had become the silence of an army. The machine hesitated. Its sensors scanned the crowd, but what it saw was not chaos. It saw order. Not the order of chains, but of will. The silence confused it, disrupted its ancient codes. The Devourer's core flickered, stuttering under the weight of what it could not understand. The council shouted in rage, demanding it fire, but still it stalled. And in that moment, the people realized the truth. The human had not only silenced the lords, he had silenced their greatest weapon. The city held its breath as the machine trembled. In the sky, the human remained calm, his silence unbroken. The war was no longer about one man. It was about the spirit he had awakened. And that spirit was spreading faster than any fire the rulers could control. The Devourer hung above the city like a dark sun. Its runes glowed, its weapons hummed, and the sky itself trembled under its weight. The council lords shouted orders, their voices sharp and filled with panic. They had unleashed their greatest weapon to end the human once and for all, but the machine hesitated. It scanned the streets below where thousands stood, silent and unyielding. It had been built to crush rebellion, yet this was no rebellion it could understand. There were no screams, no shouts, no chaos, only silence. The human stood at the center of it all, burned and scarred, his body marked by the battles he had survived. His eyes never left the devourer. He did not raise a weapon, for he carried none. He did not speak, for he had no need. His silence reached the people around him, and their silence reached further still, stretching across the entire city until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The machine's core pulsed, confused. Its ancient codes demanded fear to feed. A pawn, sound to target, chaos to destroy. But here it found nothing but unity and silence. Its systems faltered. Sparks flashed across its surface. The council lords screamed at their controls, forcing the weapon to fire. At last, the devourer unleashed its fury. A beam of blinding energy split the sky and crashed down toward the human and the silent crowd. The ground quaked, dust and fire surged, and the city seemed ready to vanish. Yet when the light cleared, they still stood. The human had not moved. Around him, the people held fast, eyes closed but unbroken. The silence had not shattered. And in that silence, the devourer cracked. Its core flickered violently, unable to process the strength of will it faced. The weapon that had ended cities screamed like a wounded beast, then tore itself apart in the sky. Flames and debris rained down, but the crowd did not run. They remained silent, standing with the man who had given them strength. From their tower, the council lords watched in horror. Their ultimate power was gone. Their voices, once feared across the stars, sounded like nothing now. The High Lord pounded his fists against the railing. This cannot be. He is only human. But deep inside, they all knew the truth. They had not been defeated by armies or weapons. They had been defeated by silence. The human walked through the ruined streets, past the fallen pieces of the devourer. The people followed, not chanting, not shouting, but walking with him in silence. Their footsteps echoed louder than any cry. The city that had once been chained now moved as one. The council tried to rally soldiers to stop him, but when the soldiers faced the human, they lowered their weapons. Many of them dropped their armor, kneeling in silence. The lords tried to command them, screaming orders, but their words carried no weight anymore. Their voices, once sharp enough to rule worlds, broke against the wall of silence that stretched through every street, every heart, every soul. At last, the human entered the council chamber. The lords stood trembling, their robes heavy with fear. The High Lord raised his staff, but his hand shook. "Say something," he demanded. "Claim your victory, curse us, mock us, but say something." The human said nothing. He only stepped closer, his eyes locked on theirs. One by one, the lords turned away, unable to meet his gaze. Their words failed them. Their pride collapsed. And in the end, their silence answered his own. Without striking a blow, without speaking a single word, the human had broken an empire built on voices of domination. Days later, the cities of the empire were different. The banners of the lords were gone. Their palaces stood empty. The people rebuilt not with speeches or decrees, but with quiet strength. Across the worlds, silence became a symbol of freedom. No longer was it seen as weakness. It was defiance. It was unity. It was power. The human did not stay to rule. He never wanted a throne, never sought a crown. Once the chains were broken and the voices of hate silenced, he walked into the horizon, leaving the people to shape their own future. They whispered about him still, but their whispers carried respect, not fear. They did not call him king or lord. They called him the Silent One. And in every marketplace, every mine, every home where chains had once rattled, when rulers tried again to raise their voices in cruelty, the people answered with silence. And the rulers knew, as the council once learned, that silence was the strongest voice of all. the legend of the human spread far beyond the stars. They whispered about him now, not as prey, not as weak, but as the one who silenced every hater in the room, the one who silenced an empire. And so the story ended, not with war drums or roaring cheers, but with the quiet power of silence that changed the galaxy forever.